Hey everybody, I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold here with our weekly lecture series. This week's lecture is sponsored by Eric Osgood. If you'd like to sponsor a lecture about whatever topic you'd like to talk about, contact my wife Karen. Her information's on the screen right now, and you can try to sponsor a lecture. Tonight's lecture is Always Sacrifice the Exchange, and during the current World Blitz and World Rapid Championship that's going on right now in New York, we've seen a lot of exchange sacrifices. I thought about using some of them for the lecture, but I already had positions prepared that I thought were good. So now, what's funny is when they were talking about exchange sacrifices on the live coverage of the World Blitz and Rapid, Jan Gustafsson, like most Europeans, was like, how did you guys call it sacrifice the exchange? Because we only call it that in America. In Europe, they call it the quality, because I guess a rook has more quality than a knight or a bishop. But we don't say that in the US. We say always sacrifice the exchange. I guess in Europe they say always sacrifice the quality. And I learned that when I lived in Europe before all of you were born. But there is a Wikipedia article about the exchange, and it says it's a material difference of a rook for a minor piece. So a rook for a bishop or a rook for a knight. And also they pointed out on the stream that they're doing for the coverage that, or they pointed out in Wikipedia, giving up a bishop for a knight is giving up the minor exchange, because a lot of grandmasters like bishops more than knights, which it says, actually the sentence is here. That's almost never used. Then they talk about the value of the exchange and what compensation is. And they also explain in the end game, the value of the exchange goes up for the rook. A rook is much better than a knight or a bishop in the end game, but in the middle game and opening, probably minor piece is better. And they show examples of exchange sacrifices in the Wikipedia article, and they talk about different kinds of chess strategy and information about sacrificing the exchange. Now, when I say always sacrifice an exchange, I mean, I'm looking for an excuse. If I win a pawn, or I double my opponent's pawns, or my pieces are active, or my opponent's rooks are inactive, I'm always trying to sacrifice the exchange. And theoretically, if you go by the point value system for the bishop and the knight and the rook, a rook is worth 2 more, but I don't believe that. So supposedly a rook is worth 5 and a minor piece is worth 3, but I've always found a minor piece and 2 pawns is always worth more than a rook. So I don't like sacrificing pieces for nothing, like I give you a knight and then I have positional play. I'm not really in favor of that, but I am in favor of sacrificing the exchange, because it's not really a sacrifice. You're just trading one piece for another, and calling it a sacrifice is insinuating that a rook is always better than a minor piece, which it's not. Okay, first game is one of the most famous in the exchange sacrifice genre, and this is between Reshevsky white and Petrosian with black, played in Zurich in 1953. There's a couple of famous books, the most famous by Bronstein on the Zurich 53 candidates tournament, which was won by Smyslov and had almost all the best players in the world. And it had a lot of famous games. This was one of them. And unlike most exchange sacrifices that I would espouse or you would see in today's games, a lot of times when somebody sacrifices the exchange, they get all kinds of compensation. Their opponent has doubled pawns, their opponent has weak pawns, their opponent's rooks aren't better than the minor piece. Maybe the side that's sacrificing the exchange wins a pawn or two. And usually, exchange sacrifices are for aggressive purposes. You're trying to get counterplay, you're trying to get the initiative, and by sacrificing the exchange, since in the middle game, usually bishops and knights are causing all the tactics, and in the end game, the rooks are the ones that dominate. Sacrifice the exchange a lot in the middle game. This exchange sacrifice is different, and this was typical Petrosian style sacrifice of an exchange. So he has the black pieces against Reshevsky. They played Nimzo Indian, which was, well, it's a very popular opening now, but it was especially popular in the Zurich 53 tournament. A lot of Nimzo Indians. Okay, E3, most popular move in the 50s, still played today. And this is your standard main line with E3. And white gets the two bishops. Pawn structure is messed up a little bit, but black's bishop on C8 isn't so great. Neither is the bishop on C1. So because white has these double pawns, which we see in a lot of Nimzo Indians, because black's playing bishop b4 and taking the knight, white isn't so worried as they normally would be because black's already played d5. Sometimes black doesn't play d5 in the Nimzo Indian. And when black doesn't play d5, these pawns are doubled for a long time. But now we can trade off our doubled pawns, open the position up somewhat, and try to use our two bishops. Okay, so black, as I indicated, didn't like the bishop on c8, so played b6. C takes d5, as I also indicated. And bishop b2. White wants to play c4 later and open up the bishop. Okay, so Petrosian must have heard me back in the 50s and played c4, which blocks up dark squared white bishop here. Bishop c2. Now, white's long-term plan is to play e4. And sometimes we just play e4. We got knight d2, we got rook e1, we got queen f3. And sometimes we prepare e4 by playing f3, then e4, and having this gigantic center. Okay, bishop g4, pinning the knight. So there's no knight d2. Queen e1, unpinning the knight, and allowing black to double the pawns. But if black does so, this makes it quite easy for white to play e4, and white's king is very safe by playing king h1, rook g1, taking over the g file. And black doesn't have any initiative against white's king, because as you can see, the black knights can't move forward anywhere without hanging themselves. So there's no black pieces to attack the white king. So bishop takes f3 wasn't very concerning for Reshevsky. Knight e4, try to stop e4 forever. Knight d2, takes, bishop h5. Black wants to trade off the white squared bishops and leave white with this bishop on b2, which isn't very strong. f3, as I indicated, bishop g6, and e4. So white did what he wanted. He moved the knight off of f3, played f3, and then he played e4, and he has a big center. But okay, I mean, white's bishop on b2 is still not very good. Okay, they maneuvered their pieces. Reshevsky had a choice here of which way to take back. Took with the pawn to keep his center. Rook e8. Now, problem is, if white never moves the pawns, then what are we doing? And if white moves the pawns, they get blockaded. So d5, knight e5, then e5, queen d5, rook e6, and How does white go forward? Okay, so queen f4. Petrosian starts counterplay on the queen side. And e5. Now, this position, black was threatening to capture on e4. So white plays e5. And at some point in the not too distant future, white would like to play d5. d5 isn't easy to play because your e-pawn's hanging. You have to calculate variations like d5, knight takes e5, d6, and then you'd have to calculate knight f3 check, and then your flag falls because you spent all your time calculating. Black played a5. He wasn't worried about d5 because the e5 pawn's not protected. Rook e3. Here comes the rook lift. Rook d8, stopping d5. Rook e1. Now, at some point, white wants to play e6 and open up the center for his white squared bishop and put pressure, on the diagonal here if we take, and the file with the rooks opposite the queen. And I think this is the position, although it could be the next position, where we finally get to the point of our lecture, rook e6. This is a very famous exchange sacrifice. It says, you're not going to play d5, you're not going to play e6, and if you take my rook and I take back, your bishop on b2 is bad, and I have total domination of the center because I can maneuver my knight to d5. And my bishop is great on g6, your bishop is terrible, and white doesn't really have a way to break through. So rook e6 is a positional defensive sacrifice, and he says, if you take my rook, there's nothing you can do later. If you don't take my rook, there's nothing you can do now. Okay, so rook e6, stopping white from playing e6, is a brilliant defensive exchange sacrifice. And it was one of the early ones in Petrosian's career, because this was played in 53. And as you all know, Petrosian was world champion in the 60s and also played super grandmaster chess 70s and 80s. In fact, when Kasparov was beating everybody in the late 70s, early 80s, and becoming one of the top 5 players in the world as a 17-year-old, wasn't doing well against Petrosian. Petrosian beat Kasparov twice. So Petrosian was good even 15 years after he was world champion. Okay, so Reshevsky played a4, and he said, I don't want to take that exchange yet, but I want my bishop to go to a3, so my bishop is good. And then Petrosian said, if you're not going to take an exchange, I'll take an exchange. Knight d5, threatening the fork. Reshevsky's like, okay, I'll take the exchange. Queen f1, stopping knight d5, winning the exchange. Then immediately, Reshevsky decided he couldn't keep the exchange and have a good position. You can see black's pieces are dominant on d5 and d3, and black's going to play b4 and get a passed pawn or two on the queen side. And so Reshevsky made the correct decision to always sacrifice the exchange. Reshevsky doesn't get any credit, but I think if Reshevsky refused to sacrifice the exchange, I think Petrosian would have been playing for a win. I think black is just better once black plays the move b4. Of course, if black played b4 here, the c4 pawn is hanging to the queen on f1. That's why he played bishop d3, queen goes to f2, we can play b4. So Reshevsky also always sacrifices the exchange. Now white's a pawn up, although white's pawn is hanging on a4. And black played b4 because black wants to take with the queen. Bishop's still not very good on b2. And now white's a pawn up, but it's symbolic. This is the pawn that white's up. That's not even a pawn up. In fact, if I was white, I'd probably take away one of my pawns if I could. Take away this pawn makes my bishop better. Take away this pawn makes my rook better. Pawns are blocking white's pieces. White's 3 pieces can't move forward because of those pawns. Okay, a4 is hanging, so a5. And white has no advantage here. The knight on d5 is too strong. So they just traded a and b pawns. And, well, okay, and here they agreed to a draw because what's going to happen is either nobody's going to do anything, that's a draw, or black's going to play queen takes a6 or rook takes a6. They're going to trade all these things because after rook takes a6, white can play rook takes b2 because the queen's overworked. And we'll get a position where white's a pawn up, but white's not better because white can't do anything. White's bishop on e1 doesn't have any attacking potential, whereas the knight on d5 is great. And if I had black the last 10 moves of this game, I would not be playing for a draw. I wouldn't even agree to a draw here. But this position's drawn, I would just rather have black. I like my knight a lot more than the bishop. And that knight got to d5 and the pawn got to e6 thanks to the brilliant rook e6 exchange sacrifice. And that was a positional exchange sacrifice to totally blockade white's center. You don't see that very often. Black wasn't sacking the exchange to get a mating attack. He was sacking the exchange so white's pawns didn't push down in the center. Okay. Let me flip the board. Okay, the next game is more in keeping with what you guys consider an exchange sacrifice. That's Mikhail Tal. He's not sacrificing an exchange for positional reasons so he can draw the game. And he's playing Kolarov in the European Team Championship 1970. In 1970, Tal was pretty good. Tal was definitely one of the top 10 players in the world in 1970. Okay, so Tal's white. It's a Carol Khan. Black's playing positionally and boring. Doesn't want to let Tal attack. Trade some pieces, trade some pawns. And the exchange sacrifice that Tal played this game is a very common one that we see in Benoni's, and Tal played the Benoni a lot. So for him this was easy. Okay, not too exciting so far. Developing their pieces, playing in the center. Black tried to stop white from playing c4 with tempo against the bishop because now if white plays c4, the d pawn's hanging. So Tal played c3, now the d pawn's not hanging. Man, those guys were good. Black says, let's trade all the pieces and draw. You've never heard of me, but you're Mikhail Tal, so I want to draw you. And Tal said, no, let's keep all the pieces on the board so I can sacrifice some of them later. Now, if you're just joining the lecture, which you're not, but maybe you're on YouTube and you started the YouTube video right now. I don't know why you would do that. I don't know. Then probably you'd be surprised to find out how many times this bishop moved. looks like the bishop moved once. But black actually played bishop f5, bishop e4, bishop d5, bishop e6. Maybe he likes baseball and he wants to run the bases. Although he's running the bases backwards. Okay, and black played rook e8. Black probably wanted to play knight f8 for defense. And also, black can move the bishop now to, let's say, d5, which they couldn't do in this position because then the e-pawn's hanging. So black wants to move the bishop, probably to d5. Black can't move the bishop. Black played rook e8. And now you can guess how Tal played the game because of the title of the lecture. Otherwise, it might be more difficult. Rook takes e6. And in the Benoni, especially in the g3 Benonis, where white's playing g3, bishop g2, often when there's a bishop on e3, black will play rook takes e3, which is the same thing as this, except Tal has white instead of black. And basically, you could ask me, and you will, why is white sacrificing the exchange? Just because he's tall? What is white's compensation? Okay, well, black's rook on a8 is terrible, so any of the white minor pieces is better than that rook. These pawns are doubled and isolated. That's terrible. And we've exposed the king, especially on this diagonal. We sacrificed the rook for a white squared bishop, and now we have a white squared bishop and they don't, and the white squares near the black king are quite weak. So what white wants to do is take his queen, bishop, and rook and attack the e6 pawn. You can guess how that happens. Queen e2, queen b3, bishop c4, rook e1. Then white would like to play knight g5 if they can get their bishop out of there and take with the knight. Man, that's looking good. So this is a long-term positional exchange sack where white gets an attack eventually, and black doesn't have any prospects. Queen e2, threatening queen takes e6 check. Black played e5. If I was black, I'd probably play knight f8, although, I mean, I wouldn't be proud. Black's pieces are all terrible, mainly on the first rank. But e5 opens up this diagonal to the king. I'm not a big fan of that. Bishop c4 check. That's the diagonal to the king I was talking about. King h8 takes on e5. So white has a pawn for the exchange. Again, this is the rook that you're so worried about. I'm not worried about that rook. And again, white has attacking ideas on the king's side with knight g5. You can imagine if white could legally play knight g5, how strong that would be, because knight f7 check is annoying. And occasionally white can play knight h4 and attack on the king's side this way. Queen c7 attacking the pawn. Bishop f7 attacking the rook. And e6. Queen c4, the idea is to play queen h4 and attack the black king this way. Queen a5, not sure how that helps. Tal plays rook e1, controls the e5 square, can play rook e5 or knight e5 later, gets his rook active. Black wants to trade queens, obviously white doesn't do that. And black sacrifices back. White was threatening bishop takes g6. And you could temporarily delay that by playing queen f5, but then I could play knight e5. And man, I'm threatening knight takes g6 check. And you can see in the middle game, especially in this one, that the minor pieces are better than the rooks. The minor pieces are doing all the heavy lifting. These rooks, I'm not scared of that. And Of all of white's pieces, the knights, bishops, queens, rooks, probably the least effective is the rook on e1. The rook on e1 is effective. It's defending the knight. But, okay, these are the pieces that are strong pieces. Okay, so black sacrificed the exchange back. And Tal said, no, I don't want that. Knight e5 is a brilliant tactic. White has a big advantage if he just takes the rook. But knight e5 has an interesting tactical point. If you take the pawn, I play knight takes g6 check, and then I take your queen. If you save your rook, I take this with check, and then I win your queen this way. And if you don't move your rook and don't take the pawn, okay, then white takes on f7 and doesn't give f7 away. So knight e5 is a really strong move, which I'm sure black overlooked. Black was probably thinking, takes, and maybe I can draw this position. Although I don't like black's position. But okay, it's not the worst position I've ever seen. But knight e5 is really strong. Knight h5 was played, which blocks up the h file. So there's no knight g6 check. And now, this particular position, white's 2 pawns up for nothing, and white has this passed e pawn. And white still has some attack against black's king. So now white is just, as Peter Lako likes to say, I've never heard anybody else say this but Peter Lako. White is collecting. White's just taking stuff. Rook e8. Knight d6 attacks the rook. Bishop f6 plays for tricks. And queen c4 pins the rook. Knight g7. Queen b3 attacks the b pawn. And he plays king f8, which just loses the b pawn because of rook d1. Probably what black was thinking was rook takes, knight takes, and the knight attacks the bishop. But after rook d1, our queen's attacked and our b pawn's attacked, and the rook can come down to d8. So he played queen e5, attacking the bishop on g5. Bishop h6. And I assume rook d6 is a time trouble mistake. On the other hand, yeah. I don't know how to play black here. But rook d6 just loses more material. I mean, everything black has is attacked and pinned. King is unsafe. Doesn't matter, I guess. And now you take, and then if they take on d6, queen takes b7, white's 2 pawns up, and if white wants to win the king and pawn ending, white can do that. If white doesn't want to win the king and pawn ending, let's say black plays this, then we can take another pawn. Got b3 pawns up. Or you could play this way, which I just discovered, which is to take, then check on a8 or b8, and then we're 3 pawns up in the king and pawn ending. That's pretty, bad for black. So after rook takes d6, black just resigned. Because after queen takes b7, it's over. But it never seemed like white was down material, even when white sacrificed the exchange, because white had so much initiative, and black's rook was trapped on a8. And the only way for black to extricate himself, sort of like Reshevsky, was to sacrifice the exchange back, but then it got to a lost position. Typical Tal. Okay, we'll flip the board. This is a game Emanuel Lasker lost in a Simul. This was the only game he lost in the Simul. And the reason I'm showing it isn't because Lasker lost or, it was a Simul or only games Lasker lost. It's because this was one of the first games recorded where we see a dragon Sicilian-esque position where black made a typical exchange sacrifice, except in 1908 it wasn't typical. Now it's typical because it's 116 years later. And so this was one of the first published games with a world champion where we got to see like well-known kind of exchange sacrifice in this opening structure. So they played Dragon Sicilian. Lasker didn't castle queenside, he castled kingside. And Lasker played very aggressively, not necessarily the safest thing to do in a simul, because you don't have time to calculate so much. But you can see White's playing super aggressive, giving away the e5 square to the knight, g5 attacking the knight, and rook takes c3. Now, why did Black sack the exchange? Because always sack the exchange. But if I'm Black, I don't really want to play knight e8. I could, but I'd rather not. And the knight on c3 is defending the pawn on e4. So this exchange sacrifice gives Black several advantages. Destroys White's center, destroys White's queenside, and also wins a pawn. That's the three excuses. Okay, and Lasker took the rook. If you take the knight on f6, Black takes, White takes, and Black takes. Black is a pawn ahead, and h3 pawn is attacked, and the e4 pawn is attacked. And Black is already a pawn up. So, not good. So Lasker had to take, knight takes e4, and nowadays, if you play Sicilian, or even if you don't, and you're a strong player, you're master or above, this is obviously good for Black because we have a lot of experience in positions where Black is sacrificing the rook on c3 and taking the e4 pawn, which is what Black did in Sicilians, and it's just too strong. White's position doesn't make any sense now without the e4 pawn. f5 pawn is weak. My knights are good in the center. Your pawn structure is terrible. Pawn structure on the king side leaves your king wide open. And Black already has a pawn. And again, I've said it before, the white rooks, they're not doing much in the early middle game. Rook on a1, that's just sitting there. Black's pieces, however, all developed in the center. Okay, bishop d3. Black gets a second pawn. Knight takes d3. Knight c5. So now White has two isolated pawns, and White's king is not safe. White's pushed all the pawns in front of his king, so his king has a lot of empty space in front of it. And Black has two pawns for the exchange, and everybody always wants two pawns for the exchange. You got two extra pawns. And again, the rook is no good on a1. Okay, f6. Knight e4, forking the queen and the f pawn. Probably overlooked by Lasker since it was a simul. Lasker probably thought Black would play bishop takes f6. And I don't know, that move looks okay. I don't see what's wrong with bishop takes f6. But knight e4 is better because we're attacking the queen and we can take the f pawn safely. Okay, now if this was a blitz game that I was playing on the internet against one of you guys and you played this move, I would think you were cheating. However, in 1908, I don't think they were using computers to cheat. Black played an excellent move here, which for somebody who's playing in a simul, I don't want to see my simul opponent make a move this good. I don't want to give a simul to that kind of guy. That guy I can play one-on-one. So White has this nice pin, but Black has this tactical response, plays queen a5. I didn't understand it until I looked at it for about 15 seconds. Maybe I'm slow. Because it looks like it just hangs the knight on f6. But problem is, if we take twice on f6, black has queen g5 check, and then black is up 3 pawns in the end game. So, well, maybe it's the middle game. So foreseeing queen g5 check is pretty good for a Simul opponent. So this guy was, definitely at least 2,000 strength minimum. Maybe better. Okay, Lasker played bishop d2. Black has 3 pawns for the exchange. So black is ahead material. White's rook on a1 still hasn't moved. All 3 of White's pawns are isolated. White is just dead lost. And Lasker resigned early, unless they don't have the complete game score. When Lasker resigned, I wouldn't be resigning. And it says Lasker resigned here. Now, this position's lost because White can't do anything. Black has all these passed center pawns. White's bishop is trapped on h6. Black's knight is probably going to f5, kicking the rook out. Black's probably going to make a couple of queens. But in a Simul, I wouldn't resign here. Maybe if I was playing another grandmaster over the board, maybe I would do it. But I guess Lasker had seen enough. His rooks are just useless. They can't do anything. The bishop on c6 just dominates the rook on d6. The rook can't go to d7. Rook can't go to d5. The rook on d6 can't move anywhere. It can move back to d1 or d2. Not really exciting. So that was a brilliant game from Black, and it was one of the first examples in the Dragon Sicilian of Black sacrificing on c3 and then playing knight takes e4. And to grandmasters today, that's a pretty obvious example because Black got a pawn, Black got the e4 pawn, which is the key pawn, and totally destroyed Black's queenside. And White's rooks, the whole game, were sort of useless. They never did anything that was too good. Okay. Okay, here's a game between Petrosian and Spassky. This is a famous game. Many of you who are watching on YouTube have seen the final blow. But in this game, Petrosian was thinking, in the future, Ben Finegold's going to lecture on exchange sacrifices. In my most famous game with Reshevsky, I only sacrificed 1 exchange. We got to do better. Okay, and this is probably the most famous Petrosian-Spassky game. And the end of the game will make you forget about the exchange sacrifice. Exchange sacrifice is. But, okay, this just shows you what a brilliant player Petrosian was. Spassky was also a brilliant player. Spassky's still alive. Spassky might be the oldest living GM, and he was world champion. I'm not saying he is the oldest GM, but the guys that I knew that were older than him are not alive anymore. So there's got to be another guy who's older than him, and Spassky is about 90. And about 2 or 3 years ago, Yuri Averbach died, and he was 100. And he got COVID when he was 99 or 98, and he survived. He died of something else later. And he said, I'll be Averbach. Okay, so this is Petrosian-Spassky from their World Championship match. Man, if you're going to play one of the greatest games of all time, the World Championship match is the place to do it. Okay, so we have a King's Indian. They still play this way now. Considered slightly better for White. Typical King's Indian stuff. Knight d1, typical Petrosian. Always retreat. Spassky, knight g4, b5, always going forward. And now f3, e4, confusing the audience. So Petrosian wants to take the knight. Spassky wants to take the rook, and equally important, if Petrosian saves his rook, Spassky has the e5 square for his knight because he played e4. So it's tactical and positional. Bishop b2, didn't sacrifice the exchange yet. Notice the knight on d1 is stopping the knight e3 fork, which makes f3 possible. Okay, and there's the knight going to e5, which was Spassky's plan when he played e4. Attacking the c4 pawn, white defended it. Spassky sacrifices a pawn and starts attacking. And Petrosian looked at his watch and he said, I haven't sacrificed the exchange yet. So he played knight e3, which defends the g2 square. So there's no queen, coming to g2 with mate. And it gets out of the way of this rook, which is now defending this rook, because the rooks were disconnected before. And maybe the knight will get somewhere good. Okay, so that's the first exchange sacrifice. And again, a lot of people who don't sacrifice the exchange, they have a very simple reason. And that is a rook is better than a minor piece. I'm not giving up my rook for a minor piece. And a rook is not better than a minor piece. A rook is sometimes better than a minor piece. Sometimes the minor piece is better, and sometimes they're equal. And every single white minor piece is better than this rook. That rook's no good. White's position has come to life. White has a pawn for the exchange. It's a passed pawn. White's threatening bishop e6 check. White's knight can go to f5. White's knight can go to e4. What have these rooks ever done for me? Okay, knight takes f4. Oh no, we stopped bishop e6 check. If only there was a way I could play bishop e6 check. Sacrifice another exchange. And there's bishop e6 check. It's almost mate. Okay, but Spassky played rook f7. He could sacrifice the exchange too. He didn't play king f8. I don't blame him. I'm guessing queen h8 check. Queen takes check. Knight f5 or knight e4. I mean, they both look good. Knight f5 allows queen g5 check. So maybe I should check here. And then I could play knight f5 check or knight e4. Anyway, white has a monster attack. And Spassky said, you sacrifice 2 exchanges, I'll sacrifice 1, then I'm the exchange up, and white's bishop on e6 is gone. Because that bishop on e6 is better than any black rook. And Petrosian said, my bishop on e6 is better than any black rook. So he didn't take that rook, played knight e4. Now white's actually threatening knight f6 check because of the pin on the rook. Okay, and then white's pieces are perfect. Black's pieces are all terrible and pinned and so forth. So white is down 2 exchanges. Queen h4, activating the queen. Knight takes d6. Queen g5 check. King h1. Now we're threatening the rook on f7. Rook a7. And now this is one of the greatest finishes in World Championship history. And this position, some of you on YouTube may start to recognize. You didn't recognize it before, but now you're like, wait a minute, I've seen this. So bishop takes rook check, rook takes, and you will know Tigran Petrosian is the Lord when you see his next move. And people who are watching live on Zoom, can you guess what white played here, forcing resignation? White's only down 1 exchange. Now it's easy to win. And my son Spencer, about 10 years ago, played this exact same trick against somebody, but he already knew the position.
Is it queen h8?
It is queen h8. Bam. You don't get to do that too often in a world championship match. In all the world championship matches I've played, I've never done anything like that. Man, the knight on a5 was never any good. Played knight a5 like on move 8 or 9, and then it just stayed there. And black resigned, obviously. After takes, we take, and white's up a piece. The only way white can sacrifice an exchange now is to promote to a rook and sacrifice for the knight. Sacrificing 3 exchanges in one game. So that's 2 brilliant exchange sacrifices by Petrosian, and then a brilliant queen sacrifice at the end, picking up all of black's pieces. I wasn't sure if there was another game. Let's find out. There is another game. Now, when the sponsor said, I want you to do a lecture on always sacrificing the exchange, this is the first game I thought up. The other games, I looked on the internet, I looked in databases, I took a million games, and I found 4 that I liked for you. This game, I already knew. I'm showing him this game, but I saved it for the end. This is Kasparov Shirov from 1994. Now, what's funny is Shirov, one of the top 10 or 20 players in the world for a long time, 15 years, and he played Kasparov more than 30 times in tournaments and matches, and he never beat Kasparov. Over 30 games. Man, the truth hurts. Okay, so they played Sveshnikov Sicilian. All theory. This theory's played today even. I guess knight b8 is theory. The knight wants to go to d7, unblock the bishop. Okay, rook b4. That's an unusual looking move. Knight c5. And when I first saw this game, I was baffled. But okay, white's center is under tremendous pressure. You know, black has a5 coming, and the knight's attacking e4, bishop at d5. This knight could go to e6 later and f4. So black has active play. And Kasparov always sacks the exchange. And I was like, you're not getting any pawns. You're not doubling black's pawns. You're just sacrificing your rook for that bishop. And what you're getting is half the board. There's 32 white squares. There's 32 dark squares. And white just gave himself all the white squares. He got rid of black's white squared bishop. The knight on d5 is there forever because it's on a white square. And I can trap your knight on b7 by playing b4. And now the knight can't move. So bishop's no good. Knight's no good. Rooks are no good. Knight on d5 is good. Bishop is good on the white squares. This knight can help the other knight on d5. And hopefully I can attack these 2 pawns. Still, that's a brilliant exchange sacrifice because he didn't get to double the pawns. He didn't get to win any pawns. He didn't get to take a center pawn. He just sacked the exchange. And he said, your bishop was good. Now your bishop's gone. Your knight's no good. My knight on d5 is good. In the long run, black doesn't have any prospects. Black can't say, I'm going to go here and I'm going to go here. Black can't do anything. Okay, so bishop g5. Bishop's better on g5. At least it can move. Knight a3, going to c4. See, I told you. And he just keeps the pawn on b4. The knight on b7 still can't move. And white castled. You may have noticed white could try to win the exchange back with knight d7. White's not interested in that, and it doesn't work because after queen a7, black's threatening queen takes f2 mate. So if white is super interested in winning his exchange back, he can do it after castles because now his f2 pawn is protected. So queen a7 doesn't hurt him. Man, look how bad that knight is on b7. And I have a passed pawn. Your pawn's weak and the bishop is trapped on the side. Rook d2. And now black sacrificed the exchange back, getting rid of white's beautiful knights. In this position, it's not easy to find a good square for the rook. Although, I guess the main problem is white's going to play knight e7 check and then queen takes f7. And in my head, I just saw a really cute variation. Usually when I see cute variations, they don't work. I don't know why it doesn't work, so I'm going to show you. Then you guys can tell me why it doesn't work. Let's move our rook somewhere. That's somewhere. Knight e7 check. Queen takes f7. And it looks like white doesn't have a threat right now, so let's take a free bishop. Then the cute move I saw was knight f8, threatening queen g8 mate with advantage. I think white just wins. I don't think you can stop queen g8 mate. Okay. So Shirov must have seen that and said, I'm already up in exchange. I'll play knight d8. He'll take his exchange back, and then I'll play knight e6, and I'll get some play. My rook's on d2. Okay, so now material is equal. White has that beautiful passed pawn. White sacrifices his bishop because he's Kasparov. King e8. If you take the bishop and I play here, it looks like you're just mated. I guess you can play g6, but that looks terrible. This looks terrible for black. Although you don't get mated. Okay, so he played king e8, stopping queen d7. Bishop c4. Queen takes h7, sacrificing his bishop again. Now, if you take the bishop, or maybe he did, that's an exchange sacrifice because I check you, your king has to go to d7, then knight b6 check, forks your king and rook. So did black sacrifice the exchange? He did. Always sacrifice the exchange. So white sacrificed an exchange, and then Shirov sacrificed two exchanges to not lose more quickly. Now white's up the exchange, and black's king is no good. White's king is good. White's up a pawn. White has a passed pawn. Bishop on h6 is trapped on the side. Terrible. Now, Kasparov sacrificed his knight. When I have white in these positions, I keep it as simple as possible. But Kasparov calculates. He says, rook here, black played queen d4. If you take the knight, I check. And then if the king goes to f6, I take the knight with check. Take on d6 with check. Man, truth hurts. So he played queen d4, which prevents rook a7 check. Now knight e3, ignoring the rook, sacrificing the exchange, because then knight f5 check wins the queen. So after knight e3, black resigned. The knight's either going to come in here winning, or I'm going to take the g pawn and queen, or I'm going to exchange it a pawn up, so I'm going to win anyway. So what's funny about those exchange sacrifice games is at least half the time their opponents didn't like their position and soon thereafter sacrificed an exchange back. Petrosian sacrificed two exchanges, then Spassky sacrificed one. And in this game, Kasparov sacrificed the exchange, then Shirov sacrificed two exchanges after that. And we saw that in other games also. Anyway, hopefully you guys can diagnose when your minor pieces are better than the rook and sacrifice the exchange when it's proper. And since it's always sacrifice the exchange, you shouldn't have any problem. I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold. Thanks for watching the lecture. And thanks, Happy New Year to everybody. This is December 31st for the live audience. For the audience watching on YouTube, it's 2025 already, but not for us. And again, I want to thank our sponsor, Eric Osgood. If you guys sponsor lectures, we lecture about almost any topic you're interested in. Thanks for watching, everybody. Bye.